Two brothers built a house together. They shared the walls, they shared the roof, they shared everything, the money, the decisions, the enemies, and the friends, until one brother started building a second house next door, and then a third, and then one across the street, and then one at the very end of the road, until the first brother woke up one morning and realized something that changed everything between them. His brother did not just want a house, he wanted the entire neighborhood. And that is exactly what is happening right now. In the year 2026, in one of the most dangerous and most consequential stretches of water on the face of this earth, the Red Sea, a body of water so narrow in some places that you could almost shout across it, a waterway so critical that 12% of all global trade passes through it every single year, a corridor so ancient that empires have lived and died trying to control it for thousands of years. And right now, two of the wealthiest and most powerful nations in the Arab world are locked head in a quiet but absolutely ferocious battle. A battle not fought with open declarations of war and massive military offensives, but fought instead with ports, proxies, air corridors, weapons shipments, and geographic checkpoints, all positioned along this one narrow strip of water connecting the Indian Ocean to the Mediterranean. Saudi Arabia on one side, the UAE on the other, and between them, a sea that neither one can afford to lose. This is not a story about religion. This is not a story about oil. This is not even really a story about politics in the conventional sense. This is a story about geography, raw, physical, ruthless geography. About what happens when one nation decides it is no longer content to share the water and instead decides it wants to own it. And about what happens when the other nation looks at the map, sees what is being built around it, and decides that enough is absolutely enough. To understand why Saudi Arabia is now actively blocking the UAE, disrupting its supply lines, squeezing its alliances, and systematically dismantling its influence coast by coast and port by port, you have to go back to the map. You have to look at what the UAE has been quietly building for the last 15 years. Because when you see it laid out on a map, you do not just understand the conflict intellectually, you feel it in your gut. You feel the weight of what is at stake. You feel exactly why Riyadh decided that the patience was finished. The Red Sea stretches roughly 1,800 kilometers from north to south. At its narrowest southern point, the Bab el-Mandeb Strait, it is only about 29 kilometers wide. 29 kilometers. That is smaller than the distance across many cities. And yet, through that tiny gap every single day, ships carrying oil, liquefied natural gas, manufactured goods, grain, electronics, automobiles, and raw materials from Asia to Europe and back again pass in a constant and absolutely relentless stream. If that strait closes, if something or someone disrupts that choke point, the entire global shipping system convulses. Prices spike overnight. Supply chains snap. Economies feel the pain within weeks, not months. This is not theoretical. The Houthi attacks that began in late 2023 already showed the world what happens. We in the Red Sea becomes unstable. Container shipping costs exploded by hundreds of %. Vessels rerouted around the Cape of Good Hope, adding weeks and millions of dollars to every single journey. The disrupt ed with drones and basic ballistic missiles. Now imagine what a full-scale geopolitical contest between two Gulf superpowers, two nations with real navies, real air forces, and real strategic depth could do to this water. Imagine what it does to global trade when the rivalry becomes truly open. Now look at the eastern side of the Red Sea, that entire coastline, nearly 2,000 kilometers of it. Angst belongs to Saudi Arabia. From the Gulf of Aqaba in the north, all the way down to the Yemeni border in the south, Saudi Arabia sits along this water like a sentinel carved from the desert. And that coastline is not merely symbolic. It is the foundation of Vision 2030, NEOM, the futuristic megacity being constructed on the Red Sea coast, new ports and new economic zones being developed, new trade routes being designed to replace the oil revenues that will eventually run out. The entire plan to turn Saudi Arabia from a petrostate into a diversified global economic powerhouse is built around this water. The Red Sea is not just strategic for Saudi Arabia, it is existential. It is the stage on which the kingdom's entire future is being performed. And then look at what the UAE has been doing on that same water. For 15 years, quietly, methodically, with genuine strategic brilliance, the UAE has been doing something that almost no one outside of special IST circles fully noticed at first. It has been building a maritime empire, not a loud empire announced in grand speeches and celebrated in public ceremonies, an empire of ports, an empire of logistics hubs, an empire of small military footholds and carefully negotiated commercial contracts scattered across the Horn of Africa and the Arabian Peninsula like chess pieces placed one by one, each one individually appearing unremarkable, but together forming something extraordinary, something that, when you step back and look at the full map, looks unmistakably like a noose being drawn slowly and deliberately around the southern end of the Red Sea. Start in Djibouti, a tiny country, barely the size of a modest state, but sitting right at the mouth of the Bab el-Mandeb Strait, the exact choke point where the Red Sea meets the Gulf of Aden and the Indian Ocean beyond. The UAE's DP World, one of the largest and most sophisticated port operators anywhere on the planet, ran the Durali container terminal there for years. It was a jewel in the Emirati crown, a critical hub. Control Djibouti's port, and you have your hand on the throat of everything that moves between Asia and Europe. Move up the African coast to Eritrea. The UAE built a military and naval base in Asab, a facility that during the Yemen War became a critical launch pad for UAE military aircraft and operations. Eritrea, a country isolated from most of the international community and desperate for investment, suddenly found itself hosting Emirati aircraft, Emirati troops, and a full Emirati logistics infrastructure right on the western bank of the Red Sea. Another foothold, another position locked into place. Cross now to Somaliland, the self-declared breakaway republic in the northern reaches of Somalia. The UAE signed a deal to develop the port of Berbera and establish a military base alongside it. Berbera sits on the Gulf of Aden, positioned just south of the Bab el-Mandeb. Another piece placed on the board, another node in the network growing stronger. Continue south along the African coast to Somalia itself. In Bosaso, the port city in Puntland, Dubai-owned P&O Ports secured development rights. And in Mogadishu, an Emirati-funded Special Forces training center quietly embedded UAE influence directly into the security architecture of the Somali federal government. The UAE was not just building ports. It was building relationships with the institutions that controlled access to those ports. And then there is Socotra, that strange and beautiful and deeply remote island sitting in the Arabian Sea, east of the Horn of Africa, belonging technically to Yemen. During the Yemen War, the UAE moved in. Military aircraft began landing on Soko, Otra's airstrip. Infrastructure was constructed. Emirati forces established a permanent presence, and Socotra, this remote and largely forgotten island, suddenly became something of genuine and enormous strategic value, a forward position from which the entire entry to the Red Sea from the Indian Ocean could be watched, monitored, and, if it ever became necessary, controlled. Now, place all of this on one single map. Socotra in the east watching the Indian Ocean approach. Asab on the Eritrean coast, controlling access to the central Red Sea from the African side. Berbera on the Gulf of Aden, commanding the southern approach. Djibouti sitting directly on the choke point at Bab el-Mandeb. Mukalla on the Yemeni coast. And across the water, Emirati influence penetrating deep into Yemen's southern territories through the Southern Transitional Council, a political and military organization that Abu Dhabi essentially built from nothing, funded with Emirati money, armed with Emirati weapons, trained by Emirati officers, and directed toward Emirati strategic goals. When you see that complete map, you see exactly what Saudi Arabia's leaders saw. Not a partner building regional stability, not an ally investing in shared security. You see encirclement. You see a tightening ring of Emirati-aligned positions wrapping systematically around the southern end of the Red Sea. You see a situation in which the UAE, if its ambitions continued unchecked, could influence, disrupt, or in a worst-case scenario, directly threaten the flow of trade through the very water on which Saudi Arabia's entire national transformation depends. And Saudi Arabia made its decision. That cannot be allowed to continue. The rupture between these two nations did not happen overnight. The cracks had been forming for years beneath the surface of a carefully maintained public alliance. Saudi Arabia and the UAE fought together in Yemen. They imposed a blockade on Qatar together in 2017. They presented to the outside world a picture of Gulf unity. Two wealthy, powerful, ambitious states moving in absolute lockstep. But underneath that surface, something fundamental was diverging. The UAE was not simply a partner executing a shared agenda. It was building its own separate agenda. And that agenda, with every passing year, aligned less and less with what Saudi Arabia needed from the region. Yemen is where the divergence became impossible to ignore. Saudi Arabia wanted Yemen kept whole, a unified state, even a fragile and dysfunctional one, because a unified Yemen was manageable. A fragmented Yemen was a permanently bleeding wound on Saudi Arabia's southern border, an ungoverned coastline, competing armed factions, endless instability stretching all the way to Aden and beyond. Saudi Arabia had poured hundreds of billions of rials into the Yemen war. It had sacrificed its international reputation over civilian casualties and humanitarian disaster. It had endured Houthi missile strikes on its own cities. It did all of this with one goal above all others: to make sure that Yemen's territory and its strategic coastline did not fall into the hands of forces hostile to Riyadh. And yet, here was the UAE, ostensibly fighting the same war alongside Saudi Arabia, simultaneously building its own parallel state structure in the south that served none of those Saudi goals. It served only Abu Dhabi. The UAE looked at Yemen and saw something entirely different from what Saudi Arabia saw. It saw ports. It saw coastline. It saw the opportunity to establish permanent positions at strategic locations through local proxies that it controlled completely. So Abu Dhabi built and backed the Southern Transitional Council, a southern separatist movement demanding an independent South Yemen carved out of the country's wreckage. The STC, armed, funded, and directed by the UAE, became one of the most effective fighting forces in the entire country. Not in service of Yemen's future, not in service of the shared war effort, in service of the UAE's geographic ambitions, and nothing else. The flashpoint that tore the alliance into the open came in late 2025. Now, let's add the dimension that makes everything harder. The dimension that removes the easy options and forces Japan into a corner it cannot escape from without pain. Japan's inflation has been above the Bank of Japan's 2% target for 4 consecutive years. Right now, it sits at 3.1%. For most of the 30 years that Japan kept rates at zero, the country could not generate inflation at all. They wanted prices to rise modestly. They tried quantitative easing, government spending, negative rates, everything. And inflation refused to appear in any sustained way. Economists and central bankers around the world looked at Japan's deflationary trap as one of the great economic puzzles of the modern era. Now inflation has arrived, and it is running above target, which means, by every textbook of monetary economics, the Bank of Japan should raise rates further to cool things down. But raising rates further means higher borrowing costs on that 1,324 trillion yen debt mountain. Higher borrowing costs mean a wider budget deficit. A wider deficit means the government must sell more bonds. Selling more bonds into a market that is already stressed means bond prices fall further and yields rise more, which increases inflation expectations, which means rates need to go even higher. The trap is complete. And inflation in Japan is not driven by a hot economy. It is driven by the weak yen. Because Japan imports almost all of its oil and a vast amount of its food, a weak yen makes everything more expensive at the grocery store and the gas station. The population, already under stress from 30 years of flat wages, is being squeezed harder every month, which is exactly why Prime Minister Takaichi's fiscal expansion platform was politically popular. People are hurting, and she promised relief. The politics made sense. The economics were a time bomb. There is no clean option in this situation. Option 1, keep rates low to ease debt servicing costs. The yen weakens further, inflation rises further, people's real purchasing power falls further. Option 2, raise rates to fight inflation. Debt servicing costs explode. Bond markets face even more pressure. The government's budget collapses. Option 3, return to mass bond buying by the Bank of Japan, essentially printing money to keep yields low. Complete loss of credibility with global investors. The yen potentially collapses in a disorderly and violent sell-off. Option 4, accept fiscal consolidation, cut spending, raise taxes. Politically impossible for a government that just won an election on promises to cut taxes and spend more. Every door leads somewhere painful. This is what the end of a 30-year experiment in unlimited cheap money actually looks like in practice. Ken Griffin, the founder and chief executive of Citadel, one of the most powerful and consistently profitable hedge funds in the world, was in Davos at the World Economic Forum when Japan's market cracked. He went on Bloomberg television, and he did not mince words. He said what was happening in Japan was an explicit warning to governments everywhere. Where, he said, the bond market vigilantes, the investors who punish irresponsible governments by demanding higher yields, who have historically been more powerful than any single government in the long run, were sending a clear message. He said the United States Congress needed to look at Japan and understand that what happens to governments that spend beyond their means is not theoretical. It is real. It is happening. Right now, in real time, in one of the most respected economies in the world. The Wall Street Journal editorial board called Japan's bond crisis one of the more serious threats to global financial stability they had seen in years. They noted that Japan represented an extreme case of a high-debt, low-growth policy model, but they made clear that the same model, in less extreme form, describes most Western economies. The United States is running a $2 trillion annual deficit on $38 trillion of total debt. European governments are carrying heavy debt loads while facing aging populations, rising defense costs, and slowing economic growth. The UK, France, Italy, none of them are in a comfortable position. If Japan, which was supposed to be uniquely stable because of its high domestic savings rate and its fiercely loyal population of bondholders, can lose bond market confidence this suddenly, then the question that no one wants to ask out loud is the most important question in global finance right now. Who is next? Let's talk about the carry trade unwind in concrete terms, because even if you have never borrowed a single yen in your life, you felt its effects. And you will feel the reversal too. The yen carry trade was not just a rich hedge fund strategy. It was the silent, invisible engine behind more than a decade of rising asset prices globally. When institutional investors could borrow in yen at zero cost and invest in U.S. technology companies, it drove stock valuations higher, which made your 401k look better every year, which made people feel wealthier, which made them spend more, which drove economic growth. When carry trade money flowed into real estate investment trusts, it kept property values elevated. When it flowed into corporate bonds, it kept borrowing costs for businesses low, which allowed companies to expand and hire. The carry trade was everywhere, in everything, and almost no one talked about it by name. Morgan Stanley estimated that even after significant carry trade positions were already closed out following the August 2024 shock, approximately $500 billion in active carry trade positions still remained outstanding in early 2026. A 20 to 30% unwind of even those remaining positions implies between $100 and $150 billion in global selling pressure, concentrated in U.S. equities and emerging market assets. And that estimate may be conservative. When that selling happens, when leveraged funds liquidate positions to repay yen-denominated loans, it hits every asset class simultaneously. The Nasdaq falls, the S&P 500 falls, emerging market currencies fall, the Mexican peso, the Brazilian real, the Indian rupee, the Indonesian rupiah, the South Korean won, all face pressure as carry trade capital exits. Their central banks are forced to raise rates to defend their currencies, even when their domestic economies need the opposite. The contagion does not stop at any border because the capital that is moving never respected borders in the first place. We saw a version of this in August 2024. It scared the world for 72 hours and then partially stabilized, but two critical things were different then. The Bank of Japan quickly walked back its rate hike, reassuring markets they would move slowly. And many carry trade participants could stay in their positions because the move, while violent, was brief. This time, the Bank of Japan is not walking anything back. Inflation is running at 3%. They cannot justify reversing. And political uncertainty from the snap election means no one knows what fiscal policy looks like in 3 months. The uncertainty itself is a market killer. Markets can price bad news. They cannot price uncertainty. So, where does this go from here? Two scenarios, one hopeful, one not. The first scenario is a managed slowdown. Japan's February 8th election produces a constrained result. Takechi wins, but without a commanding majority, forcing coalition compromises that moderate the most aggressive fiscal plans. The Bank of Japan communicates clearly and credibly that it will raise rates only very gradually, giving markets time to adjust. The US and Japan coordinate closely on currency, preventing disorderly yen moves in either direction. Japanese institutional investors rebalance slowly over months and years, not weeks, limiting the impact on foreign bond markets. Global markets experience significant turbulence. Equity markets fall 10 to 15%, treasury yields rise further, emerging markets go through a difficult period. But it remains a correction rather than a crisis. Painful, but manageable. The second scenario is an escalating debt spiral. Takaichi wins a strong mandate, interprets it as permission for her full fiscal program, and markets lose all confidence in Japan's fiscal trajectory. Yields on 30 and 40-year Japanese bonds spike to levels that no longer make mathematical sense given Japan's debt load. Levels where the interest cost alone threatens to overwhelm the entire government budget. The Bank of Japan faces its nightmare choice. If it lets yields run, the government's finances go into a visible and accelerating collapse. If it buys bonds to suppress yields, it reignites inflation and destroys its own credibility. Either path triggers a disorderly yen collapse. Japanese institutional investors, facing mark-to-market losses on their massive domestic bond portfolios, begin emergency liquidation of foreign assets, selling U.S. treasuries, European bonds, emerging market debt, in large and rapid quantities. U.S. Treasury yields surge through 5%. Mortgage rates jump to 8 or 9%. Global equity markets fall 30 to 40%. Governments everywhere face sharply higher, borrowing costs simultaneously. The world enters a synchronized recession driven not by any domestic economic failure, but by the sudden withdrawal of the liquidity that Japan had been quietly providing to the global system for 3 decades. Financial institutions that model these scenarios, major banks, the IMF, the BIS, the Federal Reserve, do not dismiss the second scenario as unlikely. They hedge against it. And when the smartest money in the world is buying insurance against something, that something is real. U.S. Treasury yields rising means mortgage rates rising. At 7.5% or 8% mortgage rates, millions of buyers who could barely afford a home at 7% can no longer afford it at all. Demand falls, prices correct. Homeowners who bought at peak prices find themselves underwater. The wealth effect reverses, people spend less, businesses invest less, the slowdown compounds. If your pension fund holds bonds, And almost every pension fund in the world holds bonds. You're exposed. For decades, Japanese government bonds sat in pension portfolios as the ultimate safe asset. Low yield, but zero risk. Now that assumption is broken, and the repricing of Japanese debt forces pension funds to recalculate their risk models, rebalance their portfolios, and in some cases absorb real losses on positions they considered permanent safe havens. And if you live anywhere outside the United States and Europe, in an emerging market that has benefited from years of capital inflows driven by the carry trade, you are exposed in the most direct way of all. Your currency weakens as carry trade capital exits. Your central bank raises rates to defend your currency. Your government's borrowing costs rise. Economic growth slows. Unemployment rises. The people WWHO feel this most acutely are not the hedge fund managers. They are the ordinary citizens of emerging economies whose governments now have to pay more to borrow, whose currencies buy less at the grocery store, and whose central banks are tightening policy at the worst possible moment. The contagion does not respect national borders or economic borders. It is already moving, right now, in this moment. There is one dimension of this story that makes it historically significant in a way that goes beyond any single financial crisis. And it is this: Japan is not Greece. Japan is not Argentina. Japan is not a fragile emerging market that borrowed in foreign currencies and got caught when the tide went out. Japan is one of the most sophisticated, most institutionally stable economies in the history of the modern world. Japan gave the world Toyota and Sony. Japan's savings culture, its population's habit of diligently saving rather than spending, funded not just Japan's own growth, but the growth of the entire world through decades of capital exports. For all of the lost decades, Japan was still considered a creditor economy of the highest quality. When the dot-com bubble burst in 2000, money moved into yen. When Lehman Brothers collapsed in 2008, money moved into yen and JGBs. When COVID hit in 2020 and panic spread globally, money moved into yen. Japan was the shelter, the safe room, the bedrock that everyone ran toward when everything else was falling. That role is now in question for the first time since the 1970s. And if the shelter has a crack in the roof, where do you run when the storm arrives? The head of De Beer Group, one of the world's largest independent financial advisory organizations, described this situation with precision that cut through all the complexity. Japan has been the world's financial shock absorber for a generation, and that role has abruptly ended. The repricing of Japanese debt is a systemic event, not a local story. Those words, systemic event, carry enormous weight. Systemic means the whole system is affected, not a sector, not a region. The whole system. This is the $12 trillion Japanese contagion, and it is not approaching. It is not forecast. It is not a warning. It is here, active, moving, spreading through every connected financial market on the planet, through every yield curve, through every currency pair, through every pension fund balance sheet, through every mortgage market, through every government that needs to borrow money to function. The question is no longer whether the world will feel this. The world is already feeling it. The question, the one that keeps economists and policymakers awake at night, is how deep the crack goes, how fast it spreads. Whether the authorities in Tokyo and Washington and Frankfurt and Beijing have the tools and the coordination and the political courage to manage this transition before it becomes something that no amount of intervention can contain. Watch Japan, watch the yen, watch the 30-year U.S. Treasury yield, watch the Nikkei. These are not abstract numbers on a financial terminal. They are vital signs. They are the heartbeat of the global financial system. And right now, that heartbeat is irregular. Something has changed, something fundamental and structural and 30 years in the making. The era of free money from Japan, the era that inflated your retirement account, held down your mortgage rate, funded the tech boom, and powered the longest bull market in history, that era is ending. Not gradually over a generation. Now, in real time. 30 years of cheap money built this world. The end of those 30 years is going to reshape it. Stay informed. Stay alert. Because when a $12 trillion domino starts to fall, when the world's biggest creditor runs out of patience with its own debt, the rest of the table does not stay standing for long.